In a universe that almost is, just out of reach beyond the edge of reality, mysterious forces underlie the fabric of existence. Energematrice 6, the very energy of creation, serves as both the elixir of life and the arsenal of destruction for its human and not-so-human denizens.
Crushing darkness, whose source they cannot fathom, grips the cosmos and its people. In anguish, they dream of the long-foretold bright star.
Join us as we embark on an epic journey, exploring the universe of Energematrice 6.
Welcome, everybody. This is the Energematrice 6 podcast. We are on episode, I believe it's 28. There we are. And we do have everybody here, and I am sitting in Kansas City in front of a tablecloth. So this is a little unusual, but we are streaming as normal. So welcome, everybody. We are working on the Vale of Mysteries, Chapter 5 today. So before we get started, let me go ahead and hit our V for V. The Energematrice 6 podcast operates on a value-for-value model. That means that we hope if we provide some value to you in your life, that you'll return that to us in whatever way you can manage. If you're interested, head over to e6universe.com and sign up for our email list to get our free ebooks and hopefully buy a physical book or some merch while you're there. Or if all you can manage right now is to leave us a good review somewhere, 5 stars or some kind of positive rating, that's more than appreciated. Thank you. This is The Vale of Mysteries, Chapter 5.
Dangerous? You're going up against Paul Cassisia. When he finds out what you've done, the Milky Way won't be far enough away for you to hide.
Spoken to Larry Hillman by an unknown companion on the eve of the disappearance, 3:39 NST. Nate's next awakening was even worse than his previous one. He had the exact same dream as before, smothering him with terror and darkness. This time, as he struggled to break sleep's iron grip, he remembered, deeply and completely, what happened before he came to the Aurora Galaxy. Father, Adrian, himself. He remembered the incessant cracking of nail guns invading his consciousness. He remembered beating his head against the wall until the dull ache drove out the intrusion. He remembered leaning on Adrian, stumbling down the hall to collapse on his bed, mentally and physically broken. Alone in his quarters on Lighthouse Station, Nate wept as a reality that was now unimaginably far away reasserted itself upon him so strongly that he wondered what was real. What was this world? His friends? E6? Which of the two was his memory, and which a dream? Gasping, Nate sat on his bed with his back against the station's wall. The knowledge of who he really was inescapable, bringing an all too familiar, clumsy near paralysis. The strange sense of two minds trying to meld together, one broken and one whole, made it nearly impossible to move. He panicked, and suddenly his body was a cage again. There were no words for the horror, the stark contrast between this bright reality he'd had for such an infinitesimally short time, being whole and capable, and what he was in that other place, what he really was. And now, that world was invading this one. His horror deepened as he saw what would happen, what his friends would say, and the destruction that was waiting for them at every step. He was too important here to be the weak link. He would turn this whole universe into a disaster. He would fail. His mind whirled around and around, caught in a pattern that was a finger's breadth from overwhelming him. Desperately, Nate reached out and opened his mind to the fields, looking for something, anything to break his mental loop. What he found, what thrust itself into his mind, was the great schemic, its pattern looping through him and into the universe, reaching out to draw everything into focus from a perspective far greater than his own. Nate understood patterns. They were like his native tongue, a language he knew instinctively. This pattern was familiar to him, like the sweat and leather smell of Father's coat when he hugged him, but so much more it was beyond expression. It gave him a perspective different from anything he could have imagined, and showed him his lives in both realities, in a new light. For a single crystalline moment, broken pieces came into alignment, and his panic subsided into wonder. He was part of a perfect design, a perfection he couldn't even fathom. Then the clarity was gone, but the sense of wonder lingered. Like holding on to Father in a strange place, it allowed him to hang on to his sanity. There were two realities. The two of him were really the same person. One was caught in a paralysis he couldn't cope with, while the other led a tiny group of truly extraordinary people into the teeth of a universe determined to destroy itself. Nate laughed aloud then, realizing that pool of memory in the back of his mind, now quiescent, still guarded its secrets. The patterns his unconscious knew so well, that he had seen with such clarity for a blazing instant, were still just beyond the reach of his conscious mind. Lastus, the Telestry, the Dominion, the Changed and their masters in twilight. The whole puzzle was both firmly before him and tantalizingly beyond his grasp. Nate sighed. At least he hadn't panicked and made a giant hole in the station, or even fallen over. Nate slid off his bed and onto his feet. Everything he did here was so effortless, so different from what he'd known his whole life. Trying to shake off the last of the double-minded feeling, Nate headed out the door, making his way to the same cafeteria as before. His friends were already there, excited for their upcoming adventure. Soon Jesse Galton joined them, and they proceeded to Adamant, as a different kind of unease stole back into Nate's awareness. Something about their situation was bothering him. Ty volunteered to go fetch Kevin, while Andrew gave John, Rachel, and Jesse a short tour of Adamant, which began with a rather necessary explanation of where the ship and its passengers had come from. When Ty and Kevin returned, Jesse was saying,
"And this type of vessel's still standard back in the Milky Way? Here we stopped building E6 machines 900 standard years ago. It was a pretty dark time after everyone got settled on Eteria. They weren't too keen on E6. It's what originally drove Paul and the other settlers out here to Sanctuary, actually."
He made a face.
No one was safe using E6 for 100 years after the escape, until the first generation had all died off except the really strong Sixers.
Sixers? You mean Energematrice?
Laura asked. Jesse nodded, and Ty frowned at him.
And by really strong energematrists, you mean the odds?
Ty asked, a smirk lurking behind the innocence in his voice. Jesse looked uncomfortable, but before he had to answer, Andrew shrugged.
We don't build many ships back home anymore. Most of that stopped when we couldn't get more people off Earth about 40 years ago.
He hesitated, then finished.
The ships we do have mostly belong to family groups.
As they all settled in, Andrew took the forward chair with Shauna on his right and Shannon on his left, as usual, while the others scattered across the acceleration couches spaced along the back of the bridge. They didn't fill up the seating, though it was over half full now, and Andrew took a careful look around to be certain everyone was secured before he sent the signal to Lighthouse Station to release the docking clamps. Nate stared into the rainbow of color being refracted back to him through space as they gently pushed away from the station, unable to keep from wondering what might happen here at Lighthouse while they were gone. The trip to the furthest giant planet took almost an hour, most of which was spent maneuvering and matching trajectory, First with the planet, then, after their sensors localized it, with Hope 1 itself. The vessel was actually at a Lagrange point between the huge gas planet and its largest moon, positioned away from any other predictable object that might dislodge it. Andrew brought Adamant to a stop rather abruptly, when their destination was still too far away to see out the main window, except when Shauna changed the view to show them the scanners. The gas giant itself, Sanctuary 5, filled one side of the bridge's great window, its clouds a psychedelic blue that outshone even the rainbow of reflected light from the Vale. As Nate stared, surprised, Andrew looked around, holding a hand to his head, and said,
Nate, I'm suddenly getting a headache. Really suddenly. This isn't normal. Do you think there's something over there?
He gestured in the direction they were pointed. When Nate looked around the bridge, he saw that the only three besides himself who weren't showing some sign of pain were John, Rachel, and Jesse. Nate frowned for a moment in thought, then nodded decisively. Don't get any closer. He looked around again. Ty, Kevin, Laura, Shannon, Shauna, are all of you feeling the same as Andrew? There was a chorus of assent and a few nods, and Ty let out a low moan. Nate addressed Jesse and the Cassizias. We need to figure out what's going on here. With that, Nate opened his senses to the fields. At first, Nate saw nothing he could identify as unusual. The planet and the moon were too far away for him to perceive normally with Energematrice 6. He would have had to work to change his perspective in order to see them, though he thought he could if he tried. Looking around again, he realized he couldn't even see Hope 1 yet. Shrugging to himself, Nate began a systematic examination of the bridge around him. He couldn't sense any Energematrice 6 intruding on them that wasn't a normal part of their surroundings. Nate shifted his perspective to a smaller scale and found the same. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Granted, ordinary was a cacophony of confusing streams of power and massive glowing fields surrounding every object in view. After a minute or two, John said thoughtfully,
Look at me, then look at Ty. I can't quite tell what's wrong, but something's off.
The two were sitting next to each other, and Nate did as John suggested. The sense of something not quite right was immediate, but what it was or what might have caused it eluded Nate. For almost another full minute, Nate watched the flows of Energematrice 6 moving through the ship and the people. It was a pattern. Something.
The schemic!
Jesse exclaimed, just as Nate himself realized what he was watching. What he saw was the web of Energematrice 6 that drew itself through and around every person on the bridge. The power that streamed through himself, John, Rachel, and Jesse was smooth and even. That which flowed around the others seemed agitated, almost vibrating with the difficulty of its passage. Nate had never actually seen how the great schemic connected him to the universe. He'd never known to look for it, but there was no doubt that's what he was looking at now. It arched off him and away in all directions, so confusing and yet perfect that he couldn't comprehend what he was perceiving. But he was left almost gasping in awe. The pattern, as he could see it, was repeated infinitely, scaling both up and down until it was infinitesimally small, its twists and whirls always repeating. After a long moment, he realized that the streams of power were going off in too many directions. It was more than a three-dimensional object, so much more so that he got lost looking at the tiniest part of it, and only he, John, Rachel, and Jesse were linked by it. John and Rachel obviously saw it too. Everybody else was hunched over in pain, or actively holding their heads in their hands. John's face was a study in awe, and Rachel said,
I didn't realize it's like it's holding the whole universe in sync.
Rachel smiled wistfully.
Dad must have keyed the space around Hope 1 somehow. It's only us four who have the schemic, and it's only letting us go near it.
John shook his head.
Dad was always so clever with this stuff.
He eyed Ty, then let out an exclamation.
Voids, it's like he's going out of phase.
It was true. Ty's body blurred briefly, as if he were preparing to vanish into nothing. Nate turned to Andrew, who was now holding his head in both hands with his eyes squeezed shut. "Get us to at least twice this distance from Hope 1, Andrew," he said. "We need to talk." It actually took almost another half hour for the others' headaches to fade, and Nate had Andrew move them even further away, almost as far from Hope 1 as it was from the gas giant, just to be certain they were clear of the effect. The explanation of what the Great Schemic was took another half hour, and by the time they finished, Nate was glad to have Jesse along. If anything, he was even better than his father at explaining the schemics, and when he'd finished, everyone around the bridge was staring at each other.
So you're telling me
Ty said.
that this schemic was reaching all the way from the vessel, which we couldn't even see yet, and making us phase out of the world?
Nate snorted. The schemic is part of the whole universe. It was the force bending space around Hope 1 getting at you. Obviously, its aim is to make sure everybody belongs to the schemic before they can enter. But that wasn't the schemic itself. It was one of Paul's traps. He grinned darkly. I'd hate to think what would happen to somebody who had imprinted a different schemic.
Yeah, that.
Ty said.
So what now?
Well, Nate said, either every one of you adopts the schemic or we turn around and go back. We can't ask anybody to endure that, and we weren't even close yet. I get the idea that the closer we get, the more effect it's going to have. Everyone was silent for what felt like a long time. Then Laura asked quietly,
You were imprinted with the schemic?
Nate nodded and held up the sigil of mysteries. It's what lets me use this. And it's more than that. After another moment's thought, Nate asked all of them to open their senses to the fields. Andrew was visibly reluctant, but they all did, and Nate told them how to look at him in order to see the Great Schemic. When he returned his attention to the group, he could see Andrew sweating. John, Rachel, and Jesse watched with knowing smiles, while the others were all raptly focused on the incredible pattern of the schemic. All except Kevin. He had turned away and was gazing across the bridge, obviously a million miles away. After a few long seconds, Andrew looked at Nate almost pleadingly, and Nate nodded. Andrew, too, turned away in relief, and Nate made a note to himself to ask about it later. Meanwhile, he turned back to look at Kevin, who was still staring across the bridge, playing absently with his UPT, and asked, "What's on your mind?" Kevin shook his head as if it was too much to put into words. "They gave us all the opportunity to imprint, you know? They spent hundreds of hours teaching us about it." He glanced down at the device in his hands, still twisting it back and forth. "I got this when I was just a kid on Lighthouse Station. A trader gave it to me. I think he saw how badly I wanted to be free, to see the galaxy. I never liked it there, even when I was a kid. You realize I've never actually used this? It's a universal positioning tool. Could save 1,000 coordinates, and I've never done it even once." Kevin looked over at Nate and made a face. "You know, I'm not really sure why I hated Sanctuary so much. I was an Nephilic with a knack for stealth, and a Radink besides. They never trusted me, not really, so I guess I never trusted them." He shook his head. "You have a chance for a fresh start," Nate said. "What do you want to do?" Kevin shook his head again, glumly. "Not sure." He turned back toward the great window to stare at the billowing clouds of dust and reflected light surrounding them. Of the three girls, Shauna was the first to break her trance-like absorption into Energematrice6 and the schemic. She immediately looked at Nate and said,
I'm in. You have to ask Andy and Shan, but...
Andrew broke in with a nod of his own.
Yeah, I'm in too.
Over the next few moments, Shannon and Laura both snapped out of their own absorption and agreed as well. 5 minutes later, Nate finally got tired of waiting for Ty to finish his examination and walked over and poked him. Ty blinked and grunted, then grinned at Nate.
Yeah, okay. That's amazing. I want it.
Nate snorted, then turned to Kevin. Well, you want us to take you back to Lighthouse? Kevin's mouth twisted. Well, they sure don't want the likes of me back at Lighthouse, eh? I'm in. Nate turned to John and Rachel. Did the keeper teach you to imprint? Rachel nodded.
Jesse knows how to.
With John, Rachel, and Jesse to do the imprinting, waves of blue and green Energematrice6 raced across Adamant's Bridge, one after another. It was only a few minutes before Nate could see the same indescribable web linking all of them. It was another few minutes before they had all reseated themselves and were trying to get a second approach to Hope 1. After they had settled in, Andrew glanced back at Nate.
How do you want to come at this? You said there are traps. I don't suppose the schemic was all we have to worry about.
Nate shook his head and looked over to John and Rachel. I don't know. You two have any thoughts? John and Rachel both shook their heads in turn. After frowning in thought for a moment, Rachel said,
Dad didn't think in straight lines. If there was an obvious way to do something, he found another. The only thing to expect is that it won't be easy.
Even as Rachel finished speaking, Andrew was shaking his head in puzzlement.
There's something wrong here. Our sensors can't get any resolution on Hope 1.
The view in the main window changed abruptly, and a blurry silver tube appeared before them. The details of the image were completely lost in noise, and Andrew shook his head again.
I have no idea why it's doing this. I can't get any read on what's interfering.
Nate nodded, slowly. Get us close enough to see it. If anyone sees anything strange, call out. Andrew nodded in return, and the fuzzy image slowly began to grow as their speed increased. Andrew was also the first to spot the anomaly. His exclamation was only a bare instant ahead of several others, however. Behind Hope 1, directly in front of them, a spiraling web of light appeared, shaped like a disc. It was tiny at first, but grew before their eyes, twisting and writhing, the density of its lines growing as it did. The disc quickly expanded past the edges of the window. Then Shannon let out an exclamation. The view in the main window changed again to show the entirety of the disc, now recognizable as a half-sphere, its near edge spiraling inward again, as if to wrap Hope 1 inside a ball.
It's closing,
Andrew said. It was true. The spiral had created a giant circular hole on their side of Hope 1 that was narrowing before their eyes. Its rate slowed as the hole continued to shrink, but at their current speed, they definitely weren't going to make it through.
We need to stop,
John said. Instead, even as John was speaking, they accelerated. The view before them leapt closer as the spiraling edges of the hole closed more and more slowly, and they were still accelerating. Andrew bared his teeth, his gaze fixed on the portal in front of them. They would make it now, it was plain.
No, stop!
John called, panic in his voice.
That is the trap.
He's right. Something's up.
Ty added. Andrew looked around and Nate nodded. Stop. Andrew let out a muffled exclamation, but he slammed a button on his board and they stopped fast enough that the G-forces left them all woozy. The hole in the web hung before them, as if waiting, still several times the size of their own vessel. They all sat and stared for a long moment. Then Andrew exclaimed again.
Abyss. I think you're right.
Without anyone quite noticing, their view of Hope 1 through the mesh of the cage had come clear, while the portal ahead was still blurred. Oddly, when he looked at the portal through Energematrice 6, Nate saw nothing, as if the portal really was a hole in the field ahead. How could you tell? Nate asked Ty. Ty shrugged.
I told you I specialize in electricity. Something's not right with that portal. Something's in the way.
John broke in again, frowning.
I think I know what it is.
Nate raised an eyebrow questioningly. Oh? John shook his head.
It's a toy. But here, look.
John held up his hand and closed his eyes, then said,
Slap my hand.
Nate tried to do so, swatting at his palm, only for his own hand to come to a complete stop a full hand's breadth in front of John's, as if he had hit a wall. It even felt like hitting a wall.
Dad taught us how to do it when we were kids.
John said.
Now, move your hand really slow. Touch my palm.
Nate did so, very slowly moving his palm in to touch John's open hand. Everyone was staring at Nate and John with fascination, and Andrew had a queasy look on his face. After a long moment, Nate withdrew his hand, then tried again to slap John's palm with the same result as before. Shannon cut in.
That looks like the same principle adamant uses for its particle collision field.
Oh? Nate asked.
Yeah.
She frowned at him thoughtfully.
You know how we set it up to slow us down when we stopped hitting high concentrations of dust on the way in? How the dust was just vaporizing when we hit it?
Nate nodded, and she made a face.
That wasn't just magic or something. The ship has a collision interdiction shield. If we hit something the size of your head or smaller, we just vaporize it instantly. Without that, we'd look like a strainer in no time. Hitting a bit of dust going that fast would make a hole clear through the ship, and us too.
Nate turned back to the screen in front of them, and he whistled. So if we'd run into that portal at any speed, we'd have been a bug on a windshield. Everyone was looking at Nate with perplexity when he turned back to the others, and he shrugged. Point is, it's a very good thing John stopped us. Shannon was frowning, though, and she shook her head.
You can't stop an object that's within even a few % of the same size you are with one of those. A lot of little objects, sure, but not big ones. It uses the mass of the ship to absorb the impact. If the field didn't just burn out, it would have vaporized both ships.
What if...
Rachel pointed behind them, at where the moon would be.
What if Dad used E6 to hook the field into the moon? Would that do? Then he made the big energy field show up as bait?
Shannon snorted.
Oh yeah, that'd do it.
She nodded to Nate.
I don't know what bugs or windshields are, but I definitely don't fancy having my particles scattered across the solar system. Just one question. How did he keep it from showing up in the fields?
John and Rachel both shrugged and shook their heads. Rachel chuckled.
Dad's tricky like that.
Nate grimaced. So, if we move forward very slowly, we should be okay? Nate asked. Shannon shrugged.
Sure.
Nate looked over at Andrew. Go ahead, try it. Andrew nodded, and soon they began moving forward again at such a slow pace they couldn't gauge their movement by the vessel ahead of them. When they reached the portal, the blur filled their window. A moment later they were through, with the only effect being a tingling sensation that passed through Nate's body, and, judging by their expressions, everyone else as well. Shortly after, the gently glowing sigil around Nate's neck brightened, and he could see a similar glow from John and Rachel's amulets. Then the sensation abated, and the amulets all glowed even brighter. Well, then there's that. Nate stared down at the sigil of mysteries, his expression halfway between grim and satisfied. How much you want to bet we'd be in serious trouble right about now without these? For the space of a breath, everyone on the bridge stared at the three pendants, their eyes wide. The rest of the long, slow trip to Hope 1 was, ironically, completely uneventful. Andrew opted to keep his acceleration low, just in case the collision field operated inside its original radius. Shannon explained that their ship's own collision field would react if something accelerated too quickly within its own radius, and Nate didn't object. He suspected that particular danger was past, but better to be safe. The pendants continued to glow painfully bright the entire time, their light a testament to their presence in some sort of Energematrice6 trap that Paul had set up almost 1,000 years ago. Outside the ship, the luminescence of the strange wireframe sphere that marked the collision field hung in space around them, while the magnified image on their main window finally had come clear. 3 endless hours later, they finally pulled up near enough to Hope 1 to get a useful, unmagnified view of their goal. It was a long cylinder with a simple cone at one end, totally unremarkable except for the rainbow of colors that reflected from its shiny exterior. Rachel gazed at the sight wistfully as the view continued to grow. As they got closer, Nate realized the vessel must have been much larger than he originally thought. John pointed to a tiny spot at the base of the vessel.
That should be the airlock.
Nate nodded thoughtfully. If true, that meant their own adamant was smaller than the diameter of the cylinder that made up Hope 1's body.
So that's what they all came to Aurora in? All our ancestors?
Ty asked. That put the vessel in perspective for all of them, and it bestowed a sense of reverence as well. As they approached the airlock and slowed to a stop, Andrew said,
John and Rachel need to go. Maybe Shannon too?
Nate nodded. I wish we could all go. Shauna made a face.
I don't know. You sure there's nothing bad over there?
Nate grimaced. We don't know, do we? Even so, we probably won't get another chance like this. Andrew shrugged.
I'll stay and take care of Adamant. Shauna should go.
Nate nodded again. Yep. In fact, everybody except Andrew should come. They all donned environment suits, and as they prepared to move into the airlock, Shannon patted Nate on the back. Her wicked amusement transmitted clearly across the comm.
Try not to break your suit this time, Nate.
And with that, I do believe that ends Chapter 5 of the Vale of Mysteries. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, kiddos. And thank you, audience. I appreciate it, everybody. And we will catch you all next time.